At last Tuesday's special city council meeting, I gave the members of the city council the opportunity to implement a residency requirement that would have taken effect almost immediately on September 1st. While I was very disappointed that my amendment to the ordinance failed on a vote of 4 yeses to 6 noes, I was even more disappointed that there was no discussion regarding the merits of the residency issue. It appears to me that some members of the city council were uncomfortable in being put in a position where they had to cast a vote as to whether or not they favored a residency requirement. It makes no sense to me to place an advisory referendum on the November 6th ballot asking voters whether or not they want the city council to implement a residency requirement when it could have been done at last Tuesday's special meeting. I would remind you that these are the same members of the city council that failed to come up with enough votes to allow Alderman McMiniman's ordinance for a residency requirement to pass out of the committee of the whole to the city council for a vote last year. As I indicated at the city council meeting on August 6th, when I voted against the referendum resolution, which caused the resolution to fail, I have always been a strong proponent of a residency requirement. That vote was not a vote against the residency requirement. It was a vote against a useless advisory referendum. The city had a residency requirement when I served as mayor from 1979 to 1987, and those were years that experienced both good and bad economic times. During the good economic times, there was no problem attracting good, capable, and qualified people to work for city government. There were positions that were hard to fill, and there will always be positions that are hard to fill whether or not the city has a residency requirement. I believe in a residency requirement. As a candidate, I voiced my support for a residency requirement and was aware that out of the 23 collective bargaining contracts the city had, only the firefighters local 37 contract had any language in it referencing a residency requirement. That language states that if the city adopted a residency requirement, that it would have to bargain with them over it. The reason that language was written into the contract was that from the firefighters local 37 perspective, they wanted the right to bargain if the city adopted a residency requirement. What has happened over time is that as a result of the labor board and court cases and rulings, residency became an issue which must be bargained in order for the city to implement it. Those rulings are based on Section 7 of the Labor Act, which requires the employer to negotiate over any matter that affects the terms and conditions of employment. If the city adopts a residency requirement, we would be changing the terms and conditions and would be required to bargain those changes in each of our 23 union contracts. As I have said, it is my opinion that it would be very expensive for the city to require a residency requirement, and frankly, something the city cannot afford. Once we would open a contract to bargain for residency, everything would be on the table. It is also important to recognize that approximately 1/3 of the city workforce is police officers and firefighters. Under state law, they cannot strike, but their contracts are subject to binding interest arbitration if the two sides cannot agree. Any wage increase that resulted from a residency requirement would be in perpetuity and very expensive for the taxpayers. If the city adopts a residency requirement, it will only impact new non-union personnel unless we can include the residency requirement in our bargaining agreements. I do not believe that that would be fair. I now have several options. I can sign something which will create a meaningless referendum because I believe that there are members of the City Council who will not vote for a residency requirement no matter what the results of the referendum are. I can veto it. Or I could do nothing and it will take effect without my signature next Tuesday, which is too late to place it on the ballot. While I believe it is a meaningless referendum, I've chosen to sign the ordinance and let the people vote for their preference. The question will be what the members of the City Council will do if the voters vote for a residency requirement in their wards. Will they then vote to pass an ordinance creating a residency requirement? that is a question which remains to be answered, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
So why did you sign it then? Were you worried of what residents might think if you weren't?
As I look at it, we had 7 members of the City Council who said that they wanted to have an advisory referendum. Again, I think it is meaningless. But in terms of having 7 members of the City Council to say that they think that this is important, I will go along with it, and we will let the majority of the people of the City of Springfield have a say in terms of which way they want this to go.
You've said a number of times it would be too expensive to renegotiate the contracts with every union. Have you put a dollar figure on that yet?
It isn't the renegotiation. When we talk in terms of opening a contract, I've done some union contracts, and there is no time you're going to sit at a bargaining table where somebody is simply going to give you something without getting something in return. And this has been a big issue in terms of city employees. It is my understanding, for example, that the Jacksonville Police Department just took a 0% increase in order to get the residency requirement out in terms of Jacksonville police officers. Now, if they are willing to take a 0% increase to get that out, if it goes to arbitration, an arbitrator is going to look at that and say, well, what is that worth? And it's going to be worth something. And again, 1/3 of our workforce has binding interest arbitration. So if we can't agree, it will be an arbitrator that would make that decision. And first, you'd have to have that arbitrator make a decision in favor of the city if it adopted a residency requirement. And if it did, then there probably would be some type of economic impact that arbitrator would award. And frankly, I just think it's something the city can't afford.
Doesn't the city, though, have leverage in those negotiations if you say, listen, this is an ordinance, this is the duly passed law of the city of Springfield, we can't approve an unlawful contract, so you have to accept this?
Again, under the State Labor Act, we have to sit down and bargain over terms and conditions of employment. And once the City Council released the residency requirement, that changed terms and conditions. If we try to change terms and conditions again, we are by law required to sit down and bargain for that.
Does this set a precedent whereby any time an alderman puts forward a measure and it doesn't get approved, they can seek a referendum on it to say, hey, the people deserve to have their say on it too?
I think that one of the things that we really need to do is to put this issue to bed. And again, I personally believe in a residency requirement. I also believe it's something the city can't afford.
But why this issue specifically? Why not lots of other issues that could also be brought up for referendum?
Again, what we have is a situation where 7 members of the City Council have voted to pass it. It's a question that they probably couldn't get a vote to override a veto. By the same token, the total cost of the referendum is $500 or less. We'll let people go ahead and have a say.
So how long do you want to put the issue to bed, though, for, if you believe that?
I really think the issue needs to be put to bed. I thought that the issue had been put to bed a week ago Tuesday.
But later down the line, if we could afford it, if the city comes into some magical money,
I don't think I'll see that day.
Okay.
I don't think I'll see that day.
Mayor, what do you say to people who argue that the council is wasting time on this issue, that you're wasting time and there's other issues that you could be focusing on right now?
I think there are other issues that the council should be focusing on, but there are members of the council that believe this is a very important issue and they are focusing on it. So as a result, it takes up time at council meetings, it takes up discussion. And I think what it does do is that it affects the morale of the employees that currently are working for city government. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think we need to put this to bed one way or the other. While this doesn't affect current employees, if we were to adopt this, it is something that a lot of city employees are very passionate about, whether they are members of a union or they're non-union.
Could a residency ordinance be structured so that it would take effect gradually as each contract comes up for renewal? And would that reduce the risk of negotiating the contracts if it's part of actually approving an overall new contract for each union?
Personally, if a residency requirement was overwhelmingly passed by the voters during this advisory referendum, my suggestion would be that if we were to implement a residency requirement, that we implement it based on the fact that everyone is affected by it. So therefore, that we wouldn't implement it until we had all the union contracts agree to that provision.
You mentioned
so
a couple.
that you're not treating some people differently than you're treating other people in city government, which I personally believe it would be unfair.
I guess my question is, though, would you have to start that process immediately, reopening contracts, or can you wait till each contract comes due and make it part of those negotiations?
I think it would be a mistake to reopen contracts.
So you would prefer that it wait, even though that might take a period of years to...
It would take a period of years, because if you look at our contracts, we really aren't going to have a lot of contracts coming up in the next couple of years.
You mentioned a couple of times that you really want to put this issue to bed, but how does this option, putting it on the ballot, put that to bed, seeing as how this is now going to be stretched out through November, and especially if the voters say they want it, then you're going to be dealing with that for a while. So
well, then people are going to have to make a decision as to how we're going to move forward with it.
Say the voters come back and overwhelmingly oppose residency requirements, and the city council passes it anyways. Would you veto it at that point?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to deal in hypotheticals, but I would believe, as I stand here today, that what you would have to have in order to influence members of the city council would be an overwhelming majority in favor of it. I think even if anything would be close, that status quo would be what would happen.
Mayor, can you speak to why you are in support of residency?
I was mayor from 1979 to 1987. We had a residency requirement. In my opinion, it did not affect our ability to recruit people into city government. City government jobs are very good jobs, and if people know the rules in terms of going to work for city government, that they have to live within the city, that doesn't cause a problem. If someone doesn't want to live within the city and you have a residency requirement, that's their choice. I mean, it's an upfront decision.
What's the benefit to the city by having a residency rule as opposed to not having one?
In all honesty, I think that you have someone that is more concerned about the city. They're more involved in terms of what is taking place within the city.
So police and firefighters today who don't live in the city limits are not as concerned about their jobs as those who do?
I think that as we have police and firefighters who may live some distance away from the city, who come here only on every third day to work, that they may have less concern in terms of the city overall and more of an interest in the community they live in than the person who lives right next door to them, who in fact may live outside the city but may live in a place like Chatham or Rochester or Pleasant Plains.
Does that make them less capable of doing their job?
The question that you have, are there local residents who could also do that job and do it equally well? And should there be some preference given to someone who lives within the city who is willing to make a full commitment to the city? And I think that is where you get into it. It's not a matter whether someone is qualified or unqualified. The question is, do you have people living within the city of Springfield who in fact are qualified and can be a firefighter or a police officer, and they just don't happen to have that job because someone who lives outside the city has the job.
Was it also an economic benefit during the time that you did have the residency requirement? Did you see more money being kept within Springfield from people spending?
I'm not going to get into the economic argument because I don't have hard and fast facts to be able to do that. But I think that if we deal with what we would try to generalize, most of the people who in fact are working for city government today, who do not live within the corporate limits, generally live within a radius of Springfield. And probably most of those people are spending the preponderance of their disposable income within the city of Springfield. If we have someone who is living 75 or 100 miles from Springfield, that's probably a different story.
Do you believe this referendum is intended to give aldermen political cover for whatever vote they ultimately take?
You'd have to ask the alderman that question.
Well, you said you think the referendum is meaningless.
I believe it is. I believe it is meaningless. I think that most members of the city council are very firm in their positions as to whether they support it or they don't support it, and I'm not sure that this advisory referendum, regardless of what the outcome, is really going to have any impact in terms of their thinking.
Have you already signed the ordinance?
No, I haven't. I thought I'd do that now.
And then have you spoken with Alderman McMenamin about what your intentions were?
Yes.
And how, can you talk about that conversation?
It just very briefly, I just told him I was going to sign it.
And his response?
Well, I'm sure he's happy. And we have emailed the members of the city council that we do plan to sign it.